So let me tell you a little bit why we're doing this and why we're here. Home was established 50 years ago in 1971 to support the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. Since that time, we've served over thousands of individuals battling divisive housing practices, and we've set local and national precedents in fair housing policy. Again, we continue to renew our commitment to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing for all people by confronting housing related inequities on a systemic level. We challenge those to ensure that we can advocate for policy change to ensure that there's not only a brighter future for all Virginians, but Virginia becomes a fairer state. We have been focusing for the last 6 weeks on four pillars of our strategic framework: combating segregated housing patterns, closing the Black-white homeownership gap, and supporting Virginia's unstable housing environment. These issues are not known to Virginia, are not new to Virginia, not new to our country, not new to me or you or anyone else. But we know that these are issues that need to be addressed and resolved, and individuals, unfortunately, are still being discriminated against. Today, we're going to focus on our role of fair housing organizations and Home's commitment to fair housing accountability. It is National Fair Housing Month, so let's also celebrate that. That's the good news. Unfortunately, the sobering reality is that more than 4 million instances of housing discrimination occur every year. The vast majority of those discrimination claims go unreported. When Americans are denied equal access to housing, it fuels unequal living standards. It also is an avenue for poverty, housing stability, and much more. Home staff works each and every day to eliminate housing discrimination and to ensure equitable housing opportunities for all people and communities. Though the laws of the land now prohibited housing bias, the fact is that for renters and buyers, housing discrimination, especially racial discrimination, remains a serious problem here in Virginia and around the country. It is true that home sellers and landlords can no longer place ads that says whites only or enforce restricted covenants that forbid sales to racial or religious minorities. But sellers and landlords and banks can discriminate in much more subtle ways. These include refusing to show applicants listing in specific neighborhoods or steering applicants who are members of minority groups to communities where they are already prevalent, thereby promoting segregation. According to HUD, housing discrimination studies indicate that same-sex couples and transgender persons in communities across the country experience demonstrably less favorable treatment than cisgender counterparts when seeking rental housing. The desperate impact legal theory of liability, which meant to address practices that have the effect on discriminating against a protected group, whether or not they were having a specific intent, such practice would have a disproportionate impact on members of a different race, even though it appears on face it can be neutral. With respect to discrimination in mortgage lending, a January 2020 study of racial and ethnic discrimination in housing from 1976 to 2016 found that in the mortgage market, racial gaps and loan denial disparity rates had declined slightly, and racial gaps in mortgage costs didn't decline at all, suggesting persistent racial discrimination. The Biden administration has recently taken some steps to combat discriminatory practices of redlining and help to reduce racial bias in lending. But housing discrimination deprives people of more than a place to live. From a wealth building perspective, it's been devastating to African Americans to build and transmit generational wealth. According to a 2019 analysis, The Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., a pretty prominent think tank, found that the average wealth at the age of 60 or 61 of those who purchased a house at the age of 45 or older was a little over $26,000 for African Americans and over $104,000 for whites. Housing discrimination is one of the most insidious forms of discrimination. It is particularly hard to tell if you've been discriminated against in housing as opposed to employment. You often don't know who else a buyer or renter is looking at in same apartments or other housing units. So today I'm excited to begin our conversation and talking with a friend of Home, the Home's former executive director, Kent Willis. Kent, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. And so let me tell you a little bit about Kent. Kent was born and raised in Hampton. Kent is a 1971 graduate of William and Mary with an A.B. in philosophy. He worked in Richmond as an advocate for progressive issues for over 40 years, first for environmental reform with the Bay Committee, and later for the rights of persons with disabilities at Goodwill Industry. He was hired as a tester for Home in 1978 and served as its executive director from 1983 to 1987. From 1987 to 2012, Kent worked for the American Civil Liberties Union of Virginia, the ACLU, the last 23 years as its executive director. Kent has retired and he is moving on to bigger and better things and serving his community. Currently, in 2014, he served on the State Board of Social Services and its chair of the Legal Redress Committee for Matthews County NAACP. He served on the board of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty from 2013 to 2019, including 2 terms as president. He's currently married to Sheila Crowley, a retired president of the National Low Income Housing Coalition since 1984. He has 2 stepdaughters and 6 grandchildren. Please join me again in welcoming Kent Willis.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Kent, for being here today. And you have played an essential and critical role in Home's history. So we want to hear a little bit about that today. For those who may not be familiar, can you tell us a little bit about the Fair Housing Act and what role does fair housing organizations play with the act?
Sure. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, and it was really the third of a series of 3 civil rights acts passed during the 60s. The 1964 Act primarily dealt with employment and public accommodations. The 65 Act was primarily voting rights. And the 68 Act was primarily fair housing. I should be careful about that because all these acts, if you look at them, have a whole lot of elements to them. But these are the sort of main central features of those acts. The interesting thing about the 1968 Fair Housing Act was that it looked as if it were not going to pass. The other 2 had passed. This was mired in Congress, and they were really unable to get the votes they needed. One analysis of it is that, and everybody knows this, one of the most powerful lobbies in this nation is the housing market, real estate and bankers. You put those 2 together and you have a very powerful lobbying market. And they were largely against the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So that was one reason it seemed that it was sort of more stuck than the other acts had been. The other, and I've seen this analysis in a few places, I don't know how true it is or if it's just speculation, but there's something more personal about your house than about, most people are employees, not employers. Most people are not restaurant owners, but they go to restaurants. And voting is this act doesn't affect you so much personally. It certainly has a broad impact on the nation, but individual voting doesn't. But there's something more personal about housing. And there's a feeling that part of the Fair Housing Act being stuck in Congress was that 90% of those people probably were homeowners, and they just couldn't get past that old notion about not being able to control their property and their community. And what happened, unfortunately, was that Martin Luther King was assassinated in April of 1968, and this bill that had been stuck for about a year in Congress suddenly passed a week later. And so there's no doubt that that was the immediate impetus for the Fair Housing Act. So that's how it got through. The way it affected organizations like Home at that time, where first of all, it brought about all these fair housing organizations. There really weren't very many, if any at all, prior to that time. So immediately with this new law, organizations began forming around the country. One aspect of it, though, was that early on, part of it was trying to figure out exactly what it meant. What did it cover? All laws, particularly the first time they go through Congress, have holes in them. So one of our first jobs at Home was to look at the laws and go to court to help define what the laws would mean for us, for other fair housing organizations, and in the future. And I believe I'm leading into kind of the second question.
Yes,
right?
yes, about the role of testers and a case that was a landmark case with Havens and Coleman. And if you could maybe share with individuals about testing and some of the relevant points that came out of the Havens Coleman's case.
I was actually hired as a tester. And so for the first 6 months I worked for Home, basically I went every morning and knocked on the door of apartment complexes. There was no internet back then, by the way. You had to knock on the door. You could make a phone call, but the best thing to do was to go knock on the door. Then you could see the apartment, of course. And so I did that paired, of course, with the black tester. And that's what I did. And I reported on the results back to Home. One of the things that frustrated us at the time was we could see through our testing program the amount of discrimination that was going on. It was pretty regular. This was the rental market we were doing at this point. But there was literally nothing we could do about it because we didn't have a bona fide plaintiff. The way the law was interpreted at the time was the only way you could bring a lawsuit would be if an individual who really wanted the apartment went to it was discriminated against. So we sort of noted that, and I remember sort of putting that on a back burner. I then did actually was promoted to doing home ownership testing, and then ended up overseeing a program where we did a sort of a systemic look at home ownership discrimination in Richmond based on race. What would often happen, of course, and I imagine this is probably Home still does this, is if someone came to us and said, I think I've been discriminated against, you test it by sending out a black person and a white person and seeing what happens. That happened in a particular case, and the people at Home who were thinking about what the Fair Housing Act meant and how it could be interpreted wondered if we couldn't file a lawsuit on behalf of this individual who'd been discriminated against, but also throw in the testers and say, wait a minute, they were discriminated against too. And while we're at it, why not throw in the organization? Here's an organization whose purpose is to promote fair housing, and it's thwarted by discrimination in the housing market. That led to the Havens case. And that case wound its way through the courts up to the US Supreme Court. And I was one of the plaintiffs in that case. So my name was there, and I got to go to the Supreme Court, and I got to watch it being argued, a fascinating process. In the end, what the court said were two really important things. First of all, testers are discriminated against like anybody else. And so they have standing to sue in court. What this meant for fair housing organizations is that they could, in cases where they needed to, proceed with lawsuits without a so-called bona fide plaintiff. Testers could go out, see if there was discrimination, and then file lawsuits on behalf of the testers. That was a huge sea change in the way fair housing organizations worked, because it's much easier to do a lot of testing than it is to find people who've been discriminated against, in part because people who are being discriminated against most of the time don't know it. All you know is you went to an apartment and they said there's none available. And the only way to find out is to throw in the testing process. The other extremely important part of this too was that fair housing organizations were given the right to have standing in court, which means they could get damages, and which means they could use the money from those damages to, for the advancement of fair housing. And so those were two really important changes that came about as a result of that lawsuit. And it came about not just for home, but for all the fair housing organizations in the country. And all of them started running their programs a little differently with this sort of new advantage that they had.
Wow, that is just amazing and exciting. And just thinking, if home was not in existence, then it might have been a longer time before testers had the ability to sue.
It took home enrichment. It also took some really sort of creative and thoughtful minds to come up with this strategy to do this. And so it's something I probably didn't appreciate so much at the time. By the way, I was a plaintiff in the Supreme Court case that said testers have standing, but I didn't have standing. And the reason I didn't individually have standing is because I wasn't discriminated against. When I went out, they told me the apartment was available.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you so much for sharing that. So you talked about the precedents of the Homans and Havens versus Coleman case. What other fair housing issues or cases were significant during your tenure as ED?
There was a lot that went on at this time because so much was developing across the country. But one of the issues that we looked at, again, sort of looking at interpretation of the Fair Housing Act, was advertising. The Fair Housing Law said you can't discriminate in advertising, but it didn't say what that meant. And what we noticed was that a huge change between the way houses were advertised before the Fair Housing Act and afterwards. We went back and looked at old Richmond Times-Dispatch articles, and what we found was that literally housing neighborhoods were marketed to white people and marketed to Black people overtly. That changed. What interested us, though, was the pictures that you saw in ads. Now, in the standard classified ads, there weren't many pictures, but there were lots of brochures. There were lots of large apartment complexes that advertised like any advertiser does by showing people enjoying their property or their food or their product. And what we noticed looking across at all the advertising you can find in the little brochure, the real estate booklets and all the rest, was almost no Black people at all. It was almost entirely white. What we did was we brought a lawsuit against an organization, an agency, a business that probably doesn't exist now, called General Services Corporation. They were the largest rental management company in Richmond at the time. And they had literally thousands of units over 10 or so apartment complexes. And they put out a very fancy brochure. It was about 10 pages long. It was 8.5 by 11. It was glossy. And we counted, I wish I could remember the exact number, but something like 300 white people in the pictures. And the only 2 Black people we could find in the entire brochure were 2 kids in a line getting onto a school bus in the background of a picture. So again, the sort of creative minds at home said advertising must apply to pictures as well. They're so powerful. And so we brought a lawsuit claiming that the Fair Housing Act covered pictures of people in ads as well as any words that might be used. And when you file a lawsuit, you get to do discovery, which means you get information that may not otherwise be available. And one of the things we found with this was the whole interaction between the advertising agency and the rental management company, all their notes and pictures of the photographs that weren't used. And there were constantly, any place where we found a photograph that had a Black tenant in it, there often was a line that said, "Don't use." One of them that was most telling was one of a swimming pool. And it was a picture of 8 or 10 people in a swimming pool at an apartment complex. And there was a black couple in the pool. And there was an arrow to it and a line said, "No blacks in pool." And so this wasn't just something that happened, unconsciously. It's easy for white people to slip into a white world. But this was absolutely intentional. This was advertising, and it was intended for it to appeal to white people and for black people to feel excluded. And so we took that case to federal court in Richmond, and we won the case. And it didn't go any further than that. About that time, it sort of became obvious with that case, and once that case was in the news, that of course the Fair Housing Act meant that you had to show blacks at least in proportion to the community in which they lived. And so it's sort of that happened with like one federal district court case, a lot of promotion on our part, and that essentially became the interpretation of the law without even having to go to the US Supreme Court.
Wow. Again, just powerful, just some of the typical simple nuances that people just overlook. Because more, like you said, more white people were looking and said, "Oh, this is a great place." Right. And then blacks probably said, "Well, this is probably not where I want to live." Exactly. And so, you talked about the Havens versus Coleman case, the general service advertising. What impact do you think that these cases have had on the fair housing industry, and why does home matter? Why is home so important?
Well, the cases were, early on after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. They and lots of other cases and lots of other creative fair housing organizations across the country begin to put together this picture of how you can promote fair housing, and it evolves to this day. I think when you think about the role of home today, and I was trying to do this comparison to almost 50 years ago when I was there, there are a couple of things that come to mind. The first is, we know that discrimination is still here. I mean, and as long as it's here, home needs to be here in organizations like home. It would be nice. My observation is that things have improved since I was in high school in the mid-'60s, and they certainly have in many ways. But as we all know, particularly from recent news, we have a long, long way to go to reach anything like racial equity in this country. And so home is an essential part of sort of promoting racial equality and continuing to do that. The other thing, though, is that, even if I were able to sit here today and say, it looks like we solved the fair housing problem, that there's almost no discrimination now. Why should home exist? At the ACLU, where I worked for a long time, there was a quote from the founder who said, "No fight for civil liberties ever stays won." And you can apply that to civil rights, certainly a close cousin to civil liberties. And I think what we can see is that even when you make advances, they don't stay there unless you remain around to protect them. Right. I think a good analogy right now is in the last 5 or 6 years in this country, we've sort of seen an undercurrent and overcurrent threat to democracy that we kind of didn't know was there. We'd all settled into, we have a democratic nation, democracy works. And then you discover that it's really about a culture, and it's about vigilance. If you just sit back, it can be eroded in lots of ways that will surprise you. So home's role in fair housing is forever. Even if 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, you feel like the problems are solved in Richmond, they are not solved forever. And you need home there and organizations like home to continue to work on those issues.
And, you talked earlier about thank you for that. And you talked earlier about the Fair Housing Act. Home has been advocating to add the additional protected classes that were not there when you were. But I think, to your point, that the racial reckoning over the last couple of years has just really exacerbated the continued racial inequities and inequalities, particularly for people of color. And so I think home has still a lot of work to do. I think there were strides that were made during your tenure, previous executive directors and CEOs, but we still have a lot more to do, and we're seeing it. We're getting, last year, I think we got over 500 calls. All of them weren't fair housing complaints, but, we're still addressing those issues each and every day. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So we thank you for all that you have done and the role that you played in some of those significant landmark cases. And we're so glad that you were here with us today. We do have time for a few questions. Are there any questions from our participants in the room? Yes.
I have one quick question. The case against GSC, what approximate year was that?
1983,
The 80s.
I believe, it's about 1983. And it was a case that went to Judge Marriage in Federal District Court in Richmond.
Thank you.
Any other questions from our participants here in the room? Okay. Looks like, do we have any questions from our virtual participants? Okay. Is there anything else, Kent, you would like to add?
No, you mentioned as you were closing
Yeah.
about adding protected classes.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about the original Fair Housing Act didn't have gender. It was race, religion, national origin. But gender wasn't added until 1974. And then familial status and disability were added in the late 80s. And of course, you have the Virginia Fair Housing Law, which does have protected classes that go beyond the federal Fair Housing Law. But the key for, I think, fair housing in the future is to keep expanding those classes to basically, it says you can't discriminate against anyone for any reason other than income, probably.
Well, Kent, again, thank you so much for your outstanding leadership as a former executive director and your contributions, not only to fair housing, to the ACLU and the other endeavors that you have. Just what a remarkable career. Could you join me in thanking Kent Willis today?